In the sweltering heat of Philadelphia's State House, as spring gave way to the uneasy summer of 1776, the air inside the Continental Congress carried the weight of a war that had already spilled blood across the colonies. For more than a year since the shots at Lexington, the fight had been one of protest, not separation, a desperate bid to reclaim the rights of Englishmen under a crown that seemed increasingly deaf to their pleas. Delegates from the 13 colonies had gathered not as revolutionaries dreaming of a new nation, but as loyal subjects seeking redress, hoping for reconciliation even as muskets fired and bayonets clashed. But the winds were shifting. What began as a defense of liberties within the empire was hardening into something far more irrevocable. Independence, once a whisper too dangerous to utter, was now a reluctant conclusion forced upon them by the unyielding realities of the battlefield. It wasn't born from lofty ideals scribbled in quiet studies, but from the smoke and grit of military necessity, the proof that resistance could endure, that British might was not invincible. Consider the turning points that had built this fragile resolve. In June of the previous year, at Bunker Hill outside Boston, colonial militia, farmers and tradesmen, armed with whatever they could muster, had stood toe-to-toe with the finest regulars in the British Army. Though the hill fell, the redcoats paid dearly, their ranks thinned by volleys that echoed across the Atlantic. It was a moral victory, a signal that the colonies could inflict pain, that the empire's grip might slip. Then came the evacuation of Boston in March 1776, a triumph engineered by the improbable genius of Henry Knox. Dragging artillery across frozen wilderness from captured Fort Ticonderoga, Knox's guns perched on Dorchester Heights forced General Howe to abandon the city without a fight. For the first time, the British fleet sailed away in retreat, granting Congress a precious breathing space amid the chaos. Philadelphia, now the safest major city in the colonies, became a sanctuary for debate, far from the immediate roar of cannon. Yet it was the South that truly tipped the scales, where fears of vulnerability had long restrained bolder voices. In February, at Moore's Creek Bridge in North Carolina, Patriot forces shattered a Loyalist uprising, scattering those who clung to the King's banner and securing the backcountry from internal threat. And just weeks before the pivotal votes in Congress, on June 28th at Sullivan's Island near Charleston, a makeshift fort of palmetto logs defied a British naval assault. Cannonballs sank harmlessly into the spongy wood, repelling an armada that had come to crush Southern resistance. These victories weren't mere skirmishes. They were assurances to delegates from Virginia, the Carolinas and Georgia that declaring independence wouldn't invite instant annihilation, that their homes and plantations might withstand the storm. Amid these military proofs, the intellectual tide turned as well. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January, cut through the illusions of reconciliation like a blade. Sold by the tens of thousands, it mocked the notion of a benevolent monarchy, arguing that separation was not treason but survival. Public opinion, once divided, began to coalesce around the idea that Britain sought conquest, not compromise, that the olive branch petitions sent to London had been met only with declarations of rebellion and promises of force. By early June, this growing confidence replaced the caution that had defined the Congress. On the 7th, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee rose to propose a resolution that sent ripples through the chamber, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The words hung in the air, a challenge to the old order, but the vote was deferred, allowing time for wavering delegates to consult their assemblies. The tension mounted as committees formed, and arguments raged behind closed doors. Nowhere was this drama more vivid than in the case of Caesar Rodney, Delaware's delegate, whose loyalty to the cause clashed with the divisions in his own colony. Stricken with illness and miles away in Dover when the call came, Rodney mounted his horse in a driving rainstorm, riding 80 miles through the night to reach Philadelphia. Arriving mud-splattered and exhausted on July 2nd, he cast the deciding vote for his delegation, tipping the balance toward unity. Without his ride, the fragile consensus might have fractured. As the delegates gathered for the final tally that day, they stood on the precipice of an irreversible choice. Behind them lay the hard-won proofs of viability, the bloodied fields of Bunker Hill, the silent retreat from Boston, the Defiant stands at Moore's Creek and Sullivan's Island. Ahead loomed the shadow of catastrophe. Intelligence reports whispered of the largest British invasion force ever assembled, massing off Staten Island near New York, poised to smash George Washington's fledgling army in the coming weeks. The Battle of Long Island, though unnamed yet, threatened to undo everything. Independence was no longer a distant dream or philosophical abstraction. It had become a stark necessity, forged in the forge of war's unrelenting pressure. With the enemy at the gates, the colonies could either hang together or surely hang separately. The decision teetered, the future uncertain, as the might of empire bore down. With the vote for independence secured on July 2nd, the Continental Congress turned to the task of justification. They needed not just a declaration, but a weapon, a document that could rally the colonies, disarm critics at home, and court allies abroad. To craft it, they appointed a committee of 5, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and, as its youngest member at 33, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. But it was Jefferson who would take up the quill, not as a visionary philosopher etching eternal truths, but as a pragmatic architect building a case for survival in a world of empires. Jefferson's selection was no accident of genius. It was a calculated political move. As a Virginian, he represented the South's weight in the fragile Union, balancing the northern voices that dominated the debates. Young and unscarred by the bitterest factional fights, he carried none of the baggage that might alienate moderates. Above all, he was a respected writer, his pen already proven in summaries of colonial grievances and Virginia's own revolutionary resolves. In a Congress where regional suspicions simmered, where New England firebrands clashed with cautious Southern planters, Jefferson emerged as a bridge, acceptable to both ends of the continent. He was the instrument they needed, precise, unassuming, and attuned to the collective pulse. Sequestered in rented rooms on the second floor of a bricklayer's house at 7th and Market Streets, Jefferson worked in relative isolation, the summer heat pressing in as Philadelphia buzzed with rumor and resolve. Away from the State House's clamor, he labored under the weight of expectation, drafting amid the creak of floorboards and the distant rumble of carts. There were no grand inspirations here, no solitary epiphanies under candlelight. This was methodical work, shaped by the urgency of a war that allowed no delays. The British fleet loomed off New York, and every day lost to drafting was a day closer to invasion. What Jefferson produced was not an outburst of originality, but a distillation of shared convictions, a strategic blueprint drawn from the grievances that had festered for a decade. He drew on the resolutions of local assemblies, the pamphlets of Paine, and the Enlightenment currents that had long circulated in colonial taverns and salons, ideas of natural rights, consent of the governed, and the right to alter oppressive rule. But these were not inventions. They were tools, wielded to express what Jefferson later reflected as not to find out new principles, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. The document's power lay in its clarity, its ability to frame rebellion as reasoned necessity, stripping away the romance to reveal the hard logic of separation. Crucially, this was no mere domestic manifesto. Jefferson wrote with an eye to the wider stage, where the colony's fate hinged on foreign perceptions. The declaration targeted the king himself, but also the courts of Europe, France, Spain, and beyond, where potential allies weighed the risks of backing upstarts against the world's preeminent power. To secure arms, loans, or even recognition, the colonies needed to prove their sovereignty, to appear not as fractious rebels, but as legitimate states exercising a rightful break. Without such legitimacy, alliances would falter. No monarch would entangle himself with traitors. Jefferson's words were calibrated to persuade these distant observers, presenting the rupture as inevitable and just, a calculated appeal to the balance of power that governed the Atlantic world. At the heart of this strategy was Jefferson's deliberate focus on King George III as the villain, indicting him personally for a litany of tyrannies, from dissolving assemblies to quartering troops, while sparing Parliament almost entirely. This was no oversight, it was tactical precision. By pinning the blame on the monarch, the declaration severed the emotional ties that still bound many colonists to their English brethren in the legislature, framing the conflict as a royal conspiracy against liberty rather than a civil war among kin. Strategically, it undermined loyalist arguments that reconciliation lay with a reformed parliament, and it appealed to European rivals who viewed Britain's king as a symbol of overreach. In the game of nations, attacking the crown directly elevated the colonies' cause from internal squabble to international drama, making their bid for independence a matter of enlightened self-defense. By mid-July, Jefferson had completed his draft, a concise indictment spanning just a few pages, handed over to the committee and then to Congress. But as he submitted it amid the hushed anticipation of the chamber, a sobering truth settled in. The writing was the easy part. Now came the crucible of debate, where every word would be dissected, alliances tested, and the fragile unity of July 2 put to the fire. With the enemy closing in, the real peril lay ahead, not in crafting the case for independence, but in forging it into something unbreakable. As Jefferson's draft circulated through the Continental Congress in the stifling days of early July 1776, the real work of forging the Declaration began, not in isolation, but in the crucible of collective scrutiny. Philadelphia, positioned at the geographical heart of the colonies, offered a veneer of security amid the war's advance, its streets alive with delegates, printers, and the incessant buzz of flies drawn to the summer humidity. Yet this centrality was fleeting. Within a year, British forces would seize the city, scattering Congress in flight. For now, in the State House chamber, with windows shuttered against eavesdroppers, the delegates dissected the document line by line, their quills poised like scalpels. This was no solitary authorship. The Declaration became a communal instrument, shaped by compromise to bind 13 disparate entities into one. Jefferson, seated in silence, watched the edits mount, his frustration evident in clenched notes but unspoken amid the debates. He knew the stakes demanded restraint. Among the passages drawing the sharpest contention was Jefferson's indictment of the transatlantic slave trade, embedded in the list of grievances against King George III. In his original draft, Jefferson charged the monarch with vetoing colonial attempts to prohibit or limit the importation of enslaved Africans, framing it as a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. This clause stood as one of the draft's most pointed accusations, shifting blame squarely onto the Crown for perpetuating a system that entangled the colonies economically and socially. The push to excise it came swiftly and decisively. Delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, where rice and indigo plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor, signaled their intent to withdraw if the language remained, viewing it as a direct assault on their colonies' foundations. Northern representatives, including merchants from ports like Philadelphia and Boston, whose ships profited from the trade's networks, aligned against it as well, prioritizing economic interests over confrontation. The unity so tenuously achieved on July 2nd, the vote that had declared the colonies free states, now teetered, threatened by a fracture that could unravel the entire enterprise before it took hold. The choice confronting Congress was stark: preserve the clause and risk splintering the alliance, or remove it to secure unanimity. In the end, excision won out, calculated as the necessary concession to maintain the coalition. This decision drew directly on the recent military assurances that had emboldened the South, victories at Moore's Creek Bridge and Sullivan's Island, which had quelled loyalist threats and demonstrated that southern coasts could resist British reprisals. Without that confidence, delegates from the Carolinas and Georgia might never have committed to independence at all. Now, it bought their continued participation, averting a division that would have left the nascent Union vulnerable to collapse under the impending British assault on New York. The clause vanished, struck from the record, to ensure the document's passage. The Declaration survived, but it did so by postponing a reckoning. The Union was preserved, at a cost that would not remain buried. With the edits complete and the compromises sealed, the Continental Congress approved the final text of the Declaration on July 4, 1776, a document crafted not as soaring rhetoric, but as a precise legal brief addressed to a skeptical world. It opened with a measured acknowledgement of the gravity at hand, that when one people dissolves ties with another, decency requires an explanation of the causes. This was no mere announcement. It was a calculated defense, designed to establish the colony's actions as lawful and inevitable in the eyes of international law and opinion. At its core, the preamble laid out the foundational arguments in straightforward terms. It asserted that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a regime becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. These principles served as the document's logical scaffolding, drawing on established ideas to frame separation as a rational response rather than rash rebellion. The heart of the Declaration, however, resided in its extensive catalogue of grievances, 27 charges levelled directly at King George III, transforming abstract principles into concrete accusations rooted in the escalating conflict. These were not vague complaints but pointed references to the war's harsh realities. The king was indicted for inciting domestic insurrections and for declaring the colonies outside his protection, effectively licensing unrestricted warfare against them. Specific acts included the burning of coastal towns, such as the destruction at Falmouth in Maine and Norfolk in Virginia, which had terrorized civilians and hardened colonial resolve. He was further accused of employing foreign mercenaries, the Hessian troops already en route with the British fleet, whose reputation for brutality amplified fears of conquest over compromise. Each grievance tied back to the military pressures that had driven the push for independence, from the shots at Lexington to the recent defences at Sullivan's Island, painting the Crown's policies as a systematic campaign of tyranny. This structure was deliberate, aimed beyond the colony's borders at the courts of Europe, France and Spain, whose navies and treasuries could tip the balance, potential allies weighing the risks of intervention, and neutral observers in the broader Atlantic world. By presenting a restrained, evidence-based case, avoiding exaggeration and focusing on verifiable acts, the Declaration sought to build credibility, positioning the United States as a sovereign entity worthy of recognition and support. In an era of absolutist monarchs, such legitimacy was essential. Without it, the colonies risked isolation as mere insurgents. Yet even as the ink dried, the Declaration's words intersected with the sword's edge. On July 9th, in New York City, General George Washington ordered the document read aloud to his assembled troops amid the clamour of cheers and the toppling of the King's statue in Bowling Green. Morale surged in that moment, a fleeting high point as soldiers absorbed the formal break from empire. But the contrast was stark. Within weeks, the British invasion force, over 30,000 strong, would overwhelm Washington's positions at the Battle of Long Island in late August, scattering the Continental Army and exposing the fragility of their stand. The case had been made, but words alone would not decide the war. The Declaration now awaited its final and most dangerous step. With the Declaration's text finalized and approved on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress prepared for the act that would seal their commitment, the signing. This was no rushed formality. A parchment copy was engrossed over the following weeks, and most delegates affixed their names on August 2nd in a chamber heavy with the implications of each stroke. The process was deliberate, allowing time for absent members to return and for the weight of the decision to settle. A public pledge that transformed words into personal peril. Signing the document elevated the stakes to their gravest level yet. In the eyes of the British Crown, this was high treason, punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering, with estates forfeited and families left destitute. The signers knew the risks intimately. With the massive British force anchored off Staten Island, poised to strike New York, failure in the field could mean swift capture and exemplary punishment. As Benjamin Franklin remarked amid the proceedings, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Another observer, William Ellery of Rhode Island, later described watching the men approach the table as if witnessing them sign their own death warrants, faces etched with resolve, hands steady despite the shadow of the gallows. Beyond personal danger, the Declaration ignited a civil war within the colonies themselves, compelling every inhabitant to choose sides in a conflict that pitted neighbour against neighbour. No longer could one cling to neutrality. The document branded loyalists as enemies within, justifying their suppression just as it invited British reprisals. This division echoed the recent clash at Moores Creek Bridge, where loyalist Scots Highlanders had risen only to be crushed by Patriot militia, fracturing communities along lines of allegiance. The war's intimate scale bred betrayal, foreshadowing the treacheries of figures like Benedict Arnold, who would defect to the British, and Edward Bancroft, a double agent embedded in the American diplomatic corps. Treason, once a distant accusation from London, now cut both ways, turning the revolution into a contest of loyalties as much as armies. Even as the ink dried on the signatures, the war rushed forward to test the gamble. The British invasion of New York loomed immediate and overwhelming, with General Howe's troops outnumbering Washington's ragged forces by a wide margin. Independence had been declared not from a position of strength but amid vulnerability, before any foreign alliances materialized, before the Continental Army proved it could endure. The delegates had staked everything on a union unproven, a cause unvictorious. The declaration did not guarantee freedom, it guaranteed consequences. As the summer waned, the decision of July 1776 faced its first brutal trial at Long Island, where the might of empire would descend without mercy, testing whether the words on parchment could outlast the steel of invasion. If you've been gripped by this gritty tale of revolution and resilience, consider subscribing to our channel for more immersive dives into the Revolutionary War's pivotal moments. A like and share would help spread these stories far and wide, ensuring the lessons of the past endure. Thank you for joining us in this journey back to the fires in the age of revolution. Until next time, remember, in the heat of battle, courage is forged.